Well, Brett, I'm so excited to have you on the podcast. When you emailed me, I thought of somebody in particular that would probably really benefit from this episode. And so I'm really excited to just record your story and have everybody hear it. You know, if I know somebody, I'm sure there's a lot more people that would really benefit from hearing. So, yeah, I'd love to start with just hearing a little bit about you and just some context for who you are, and then we can jump into your story.
Yeah, and thanks again for having me on. I think it's a great work that you're doing. Looking through the episodes looks very interesting and I think helpful for a lot of people. So,
Yeah.
um, so as far as background on I guess my story, let's see. So I grew up in the church. My parents were both very active when I was growing up. They both grew up in the Salt Lake area. I grew up in a little town called Gardnerville, Nevada, outside of Lake Tahoe. We weren't that family that has like multiple generations of like sterling, pioneer stock, right? We were a little bit more rough around the edges. Both my parents grew up in the Salt Lake area, and both of their families were inactive for different reasons. On my mom's side of the family, there was a lot of kind of religious fanaticism. And so my grandpa, my mom's dad, he just decided, they had some family members that were leaders of polygamous breakaway groups and things like that. And he looked
Mm.
at the landscape and was like, you know what, I think we're just gonna get out ahead of this and become inactive. So so I always thought it was kind of funny. They became active later and like served in the temple and whatnot. So my mom kind of gained her own testimony of the Book of Mormon growing up. And then on my dad's side of the family, so my dad was born while my grandfather was serving in World War II, and my grandfather came back a broken man. He was an alcoholic and just in and out of employment and everything. And so my dad grew up outside of the church, just kind of running the streets. But for him, it was super important. He kind of made this goal for himself that like I feel ashamed of my family, feel ashamed of my circumstances. Like I want my kids to have something better than what I have. I want to have a great family when I grow up. And so for my dad, he saw the church and kind of the functional member families around him as the role model of what he wanted to become. And so, so his whole life, it was like he always just loved what the church had done for him, both giving him a model and a kind of vehicle for being able to achieve his vision, his dream of raising a great family. So anyway, so that's part of the background. And then as for myself, I've got 9 kids.
Wow.
Yeah, the oldest is serving a mission in Chile right now, and the youngest is 9 months old.
Love that. Yeah, let's jump into your story. Love
Okay,
to hear more
great.
about it.
So my story, starts I think when I was younger. I kind of realized there were a lot of ideas floating around, like I mentioned, on both sides of the family, and I kind of realized that we had a little bit of a wayward tendency, like that song, "Prone to Wander." That's kind of us, I guess. Even as a teenager, I always grew up very close to the gospel, very devout. But I realized that there were these kind of factors out there, and I remember making a deal with God, like if I ever stray from the church, you have full permission to smite me. So, and so then, I did the normal stuff, went to BYU, and then served a mission in Mexico. But I've always been like super skeptical, like kind of extremely skeptical. People that have gotten to know me well, they're just like, oh my gosh, like, do you have to be like so skeptical? And it's just like, I don't know. And this is just like who I am, you know?
Yeah.
And so,
Like just in your nature.
yeah. So I'm sorry. We all struggle with different things. That's, I guess, my struggle. And I think it served me very well in many circumstances, right? So like my general philosophy was like, if a belief or an idea is unsubstantiated, then I'm kind of not going to commit myself to that. I'm not going to allow it to, become a part of my truth. And it really helped to kind of keep a lot of bad ideas at bay. But then, as you can imagine, that started to work its way into my belief in the church, more belief in God, really. But yeah, so I'm serving a mission in Mexico and studying the scriptures every day, but I can just kind of feel this like building skepticism of you enter this like age of not believing. And it was more difficult to believe in the Book of Mormon, more difficult to believe in all of these kind of elements that require faith. And it was okay, like while I was on my mission, you're still studying, you're still having spiritual experiences, and I loved all of that. And then I get back to BYU, and that's when things kind of came to a head. I'd taken biology classes and studied evolution. I'd taken astronomy class and physics classes and everything. Just given my skepticism, I was trying to find a way for this to not be an unsubstantiated belief. I love the church's philosophy, right? Which is like, they're not saying that like it's a mystery, you're not allowed to ask. They're like, it's okay. Like we believe in all truth, the glory of God is intelligence, right? And so I kind of dove into this search for truth, thinking that I would find God. I'd find him like in the universe, or I'd find him in the creative process. And I didn't find him anywhere. And I felt like not only did I not find him, but I felt like the rules of physics that I was understanding, and kind of the processes of evolution that I was learning just seemed to kind of negate any possibility that there was a God. And I feel like there are a lot of members who, or believers even of other faiths, where these kind of two realities build up of like your belief in the Bible and the stories there, and or your learning of the physical world or whatever. And so for me, it just finally kind of came to a head of like, I can't continue to maintain this tension. I'm going to follow my search for truth. So I became an atheist. And when I describe that, to those that haven't maybe gone through the process, I just want to make sure I kind of clarify like what that means, what that experience is like and everything. What I mean by an atheist is like, it was like an active disbelief in God. He doesn't exist. The universe says he doesn't exist. And I see no way of him possibly existing.
You're coming to this conclusion while you're at BYU,
Yes.
correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I was a lot like my father in that, I had the goals of having a great family. And so people are like, did you leave the church or whatever? And it's like, no, I think that just because you become an atheist doesn't mean like you stop brushing your teeth.
Right.
You still do those things that are good for you. And I always thought the church was good for me and would be good for my future, be good for my family. And my problems never were with the church, like weren't with the prophets or church history, even though like that was a big part of my search for truth. I'm open to like reading all of that stuff, but the big problem for me was this like physics stuff and trying to reconcile everything. So
So
yeah,
when you say that you like the problem wasn't with profits and, things like that, do you mean like if you're ultimately believing that I don't believe there is a God, but like, but are you saying like your problem wasn't with like maybe, a lot of people grapple with prophets being imperfect, or
yeah.
tell me a little bit more about that. Did you like have a belief in prophets or like, but I'm assuming no. So tell me a little bit more about
Well,
that.
yeah, I'm not going to say it all makes sense. I don't think any of us humans like perfectly make sense, and I didn't fully make sense. Well, or rather, maybe the way of putting it was, I was on a journey seeking truth, and I felt like that meant accepting all truth that I found, even if I couldn't reconcile it. So, so I had some interesting experiences on my mission. Our mission was a lot about baptizing people, and there was a lot of pressure. And so I was kind of in the situation of like, what should I be doing? And I didn't have a good testimony of the prophets going into my mission because, my parents kind of didn't either. It was just part of our background or whatever. But, my whole mission is like every time I read a teaching by the prophet or an apostle, I was like, I completely agree with that. Like the Spirit testifies to me that that's true. And as I look at the prophets, I never was able to like be like, oh yeah, they're being selfish or they're driving like super nice cars or it's all about the money or whatever. So I didn't know how to reconcile it. But to me, one truth I had no reason to abandon or that I still adhered to was that the prophets don't make sense, right? If there's no God, it doesn't make sense what they're doing. Like, because I really feel like they're genuinely selfless people. They seem to be inspired. I don't know how this all fits together. So anyway, it wasn't a problem with that so much as it was like okay, yeah, I see this truth over here, but then there's this other truth I feel like, which is that there can't be a God. The rules seem to disallow it. And so yeah, anyway, does that clarify?
Yes, that totally makes sense. Yes.
Okay. So yeah, so then the first week of becoming an atheist is just like, like this is like so liberating, and oh my gosh, we're swirling around on this speck of dust in this vast universe, and we only have these few moments to be alive, and it's just finally like in so much relief. And then after about a week, that wears off, and it's just completely terrible after that. So we live in a meaningless universe. We're just like these products of evolution, which are these random occurrences over time, and we're just like these biochemical packets interacting with each other. Nothing has any kind of long-term significance, etc. And so it is just like this kind of instant existential crisis, I guess.
Mhm. So then you're going through and processing all of this stuff while you're at BYU. Keep going. Just keep going with your story.
So yeah, so I'm going through this at BYU, and I'm mostly keeping it to myself, right? Because like for for
That's another thing that I was going to ask because you
yeah,
clearly you're not married yet,
no, I'm
right?
single.
Okay. So I was curious as to like the people around you. Are you like expressing this or
Yeah, so I was dating a girl at the time, not my wife, and unfortunately, like I was trying going through all of this at the same time that we were dating, and I ended up kind of sending her into a bit of a tailspin, which I kind of didn't know about at the time, but later she left the church, didn't find her way back. So I kind of feel terrible about that. I was just like in my own kind of search for truth. Mostly, I kept it to myself, but yeah, I do remember mentioning it to another gal that I dated just a little bit. She's like, "You need to open up more. Like, I feel like I don't really know you." And it's like, "Okay, you want to know what's going on? Like, here's what's going on." And she's just like, "Oh, put it back in the box." Like,
like it's a lot?
yeah, yeah. She's like, you need to repent, and you're being misled and stuff. And it's just like, oh, I get it. I get like why you. So that ended
Yeah.
that night. As far as like with my wife, I still didn't have my head screwed on straight as we were dating, but she was amazing. Like I think to her credit, she just realized that like, hey, he's not looking for an excuse to like leave the church or to stop paying tithing or any of these other things. It seemed like he's just genuinely searching. And so,
Yeah.
somehow she kind of trusted that I would get things figured out even as we're going through these different phases of, dating and getting engaged and everything. And I guess one of the things I, also wanted to express during this time is just kind of how, like, it's easy to drive into the ditch, but then, like, how do you get back out of the ditch, right? Like, I didn't understand how any of this worked. And I think maybe a number, other people go through a similar experience, right? So, like, when you're trying to justify or substantiate beliefs in the gospel, like a belief in God or a Christian of the universe or whatever, like the Bible's not written that way, right? The Book of Mormon is not written that way. And the way the prophets and apostles, they're not giving logical proofs, they're not dispensing, scientific evidence. And I don't think they should, right? Because like the purpose of the gospel is, in my opinion, is to like convert people, not to convince. Convincing people serving a mission or whatever is like that's not worth anything, right? We were trying to get people to change their attitude to be followers of Christ. But the problem is that like for some of us that are highly skeptical, it's like I want to remain converted. But my particular struggle, like I didn't struggle with a lot of this other stuff, whether it's word of wisdom or paying tithing or whatever. But I really struggled with like how do I maintain my conversion without some way of like being convinced? And so that's what really I think was my big my huge struggle. And then the inability to like read the scriptures and find a logical proof there, or well, what about like spiritual witnesses or whatever? And for so I had spiritual witnesses my whole life, felt close to the Spirit, felt the Spirit almost every sacrament meeting. But when you get into these skeptical places, there are like answers for everything. Like you learn about studies where they can put like electrical signals in your brain or magnetic fields in your brain, and they can kind of create these like mystical experiences or these like what people describe as like spiritual experiences. And so you're thinking like, oh, are my spiritual witnesses like even worth anything? Feeling the Spirit, like how do I justify that? How do I substantiate that that's real too? And so it's just kind of like this skepticism of so many things. When you look at that being so skeptical, it's like I don't know. And again, I don't think the church should change anything, honestly. Like I don't think it should try to convince us. I don't think it should, specifically endorse like secular theories or anything to help us. But I do think that, maybe we can cater a little bit more to each other, right? It's like what have we found? How have we kind of worked things out? And none of which is like endorsed by the church or anything, but whatever helps us with our particular struggle to kind of regain our devotion, I guess.
I think that is right in line with the podcast. Like this podcast is not church sponsored. It's interesting because I totally agree with you. Like it's not the church's responsibility to provide proof and evidence
No.
and like we need to have faith. And I've heard so many people come on the podcast and they say that after all this searching and all this time spent, go doing all of this research, I came to the conclusion that there's just as much evidence that it's true as there is that it's not true. And so it was left up for me to decide. And I think that that's, where faith comes in. And then I think also once you can allow yourself to accept that I'm choosing to believe and I'm choosing to have faith, then spiritual experiences follow after that. Choice is made.
I totally agree with what you're saying, which is that,
Yeah.
like there's in the Book of Mormon talks about the seed, right? It's like you have to
Right.
plant the seed if you want to experiment on the word. So I totally agree with all of that. And I felt like that was also my position was like, I'm going to continue to follow the gospel, I'm going to continue to go to church and be active and everything. Like I'm doing what I can. I am not able to figure this out. So anyway, so I'm, dating my wife Jenica. I ended up, flying back for a buddy's wedding here in Reno. And, I just remember like I'm trying to decide if we're gonna get, we're trying to decide if we're gonna get engaged. And it's like, how can I get sealed in the temple? Like, what am I doing? Like, I recognize this truth on this side of things. I can't reconcile it with this truth that I found over here. And, and also just like, I have no idea how I'm going to get back on track. I remember going for a walk at this local park and it's at night and I'm just, sobbing like a hot mess. I saw a sign and, I'm not going to describe what it was. It's not going to mean anything to, I think, anybody else. But there was a specific moment where between God and myself, he was like, here's a physical sign. And I was just like, like, because, I always understood that, you weren't supposed to ask for a sign. And I wasn't. Like, I wasn't asking for a sign. And like I said, even spiritual confirmations, I was able to kind of like rationalize away or whatever. But I think God, in his mercy, was like, hey, I can help you too. I can help you in the way that you need to be helped. So I had that experience and it was just like, oh, this is so great. Like I'm like it's gonna come together now. Everything's awesome. And then that lasted, maybe like a couple days. Again, like I still had a physical witness. I still had like this hope that I could figure things out, but I still had all of this reconciling that had yet to be done. So I married my wife. We stayed active, but I continued to struggle with this kind of disbelief for the next 4 years until I was kind of able to figure out some ways of maybe reconciling things.
During this time, the 4 years, were you still pretty open with your wife about how you were feeling?
Yeah, yeah.
What was her response to that? Like how did she react?
I mean, she's wonderful. Like my wife is amazing. She's very understanding, very empathetic. I wouldn't say that she wanted to hear like a tremendous amount about it, like understandably. So, so it's just kind of those things where I'm trying to work through myself. I'm like reading like Russian novelists and, physics or whatever. And so she was very supportive, but it was definitely, she wasn't
Yeah.
too keen on, I guess.
So during that time, that 4 years, you're still going to church, you're still
Yeah.
active.
Kids and, yep.
Okay. Okay. So then what happened after that?
So then after that, it was just like, okay, like God, I know you exist. I don't know how that's possible. And
And you're tying the "I know you exist" back to
to
the
this kind of
sign.
physical, yeah, like I'm going to believe my eyes. There was a sign. I believe that happened. I'm not going to deny that, right? Because I
Okay.
feel, yeah, I feel like in my search for truth, I have to collect all sources of truth, even if I can't reconcile them right now. So it was one of those things where, okay, I think like this is true, and I don't know how it works in yet, but and then kind of to describe the particular condition that I have, and maybe other people that are skeptical, or maybe I should back up a little bit. So some people found out that I'm atheist or that I was atheist, and they're like, can you talk to so and so? Can you talk to my husband or what works for you or whatever? And I feel like if you're not trying, if you're not seeking, if you're not willing to believe, if you're not open to faith, you need to do those things, right? In order to like nothing I say or nothing I figured out is going to convince anybody to have the truth. But at least for my particular position, it was like, hey, I want to believe, like I want to be converted. I just need like one way. Like it doesn't have to be the way, but just one way that I can reconcile everything such that God could exist, that he could administer over our earth and all that other stuff. I don't know that I realized it, but that's what I was really looking for is like one way for this all to be able to, possibly come together. I think what happens a lot of times when if you think about like kind of secular versus religious kind of debates out there in the world, a lot of the debate out there is about it's about religion versus like evolution, right? And it's an attempt to say that evolution wasn't how we were created, and et cetera, et cetera. What I would recommend or found very interesting was going into physics. I guess I'd like to talk about some of the trends in physics that I think have helped, me to kind of, see a way that it's possible. So like, I took multiple physics classes at BYU, and, we covered like quantum mechanics and special relativity and things like that. I work for a photonics company. I sell into the semiconductor industry. So these, quantum phenomena and stuff, that's basically how a lot of our stuff works. When it comes to like physics, one of the things I didn't realize, or I kind of accepted the story that like physics is like it's understood and it's this like known science. But kind of the more you get into physics, the more you realize it's like totally crazy. They discovered a bunch of things and they're like, hey, this doesn't make like much sense. As you start traveling closer to the speed of light, time slows down for you. Why is that? I mean, that's like super established physics, right? Like, why does that happen? Or like you can entangle, two photons and send them to either part of the galaxy, and you measure one photon and it immediately, like simultaneously, kind of affects the other photon, like across the galaxy. And you're just like, how does like this is just crazy. And there are many, many like instances where physics does things that it's just like it doesn't behave the way that you would expect it to behave. So for a long time, the physicists like they couldn't figure out like why it was that way, and so there became this model of just like shut up and calculate. It's just like we don't know why. And then when they teach physics in universities, they start out like, especially with quantum mechanics and stuff, they start out by saying like, oh, this is really unintuitive, which is, in my opinion, like a way of saying like this doesn't make any sense. And that's kind of been the MO for a long time in physics. But what I see happening is that a lot of younger people are, growing up playing video games and kind of interacting with these like virtual universes. And then they start to learn the laws of physics, and they start to see that, like, wait a second, this isn't unintuitive. It looks like information. It behaves like information. So my degree's in computer science, and I've gone back and done an analysis of like, do any of the laws of the universe violate the rules of information systems? And I haven't been able to find any. And so again, I'm not saying that this is absolutely the way that God did it, or this is exactly the way the universe is structured, but for me, it was a great outlet of like, okay, this is maybe how he did it. And I guess I'd like to explain like what that means, right? If our universe is made out of information. So for example, like throughout history, this continuous tension, right, for people of all faiths, where they read the Bible and then like, oh, that doesn't concord with natural law. So, Einstein, he grew up, his parents were secular, he was going to a Catholic school, and of his own volition, he was like, I'm going to become devout to Judaism. And so he did, and he was observant at great inconvenience. And but then later in life, he read the Bible, and he was like, "Oh, that's just it's ridiculous. Like there's just a bunch of stories," and lost his devotion to Judaism. Like another example is Thomas Jefferson, where he's like, "I believe Jesus' teachings," but Thomas Jefferson rewrote like all the Gospels to subtract out all of the miracles that Jesus performed, to kind of take out the magical stuff. And then even today, right? Like I follow an economist, Garrett Jones, on Twitter. He grew up in the church, started a mission, just kind of left the church and just said, hey, I just don't believe in supernatural stuff. So the reason I love, thinking about one way that it might have happened is that if our universe is, or our planet or whatever is made up of information, it allows you to reconcile a lot of things. So for example, like if you look out at the universe, it looks like it's 13.7 billion years old. But then, of course, it's like, well, how does that work? Like, did God create it that long ago? Or in the creation story, it should have been like 6,000 years ago. It looks like our Earth is like 4.5 billion years old. But the thing is, like, if our world is made out of information, if our universe is made out of information, it can look really old, but not actually be old. And I kind of use the example of like, if your kid is playing Minecraft and they log into this Minecraft world, and then you go up and ask them like, hey, how long have you been on there? Oh, I've been here for 3 minutes, right? I just booted up. And then you say, well, if you look at the Minecraft world, how old does it look? And they look around and it's like, well, that looks like a 20-year-old dolphin. And, like I'm digging down and there's dig down to bedrock and there are towns and oceans and mountains and everything. It looks old, but it's actually not old, right? It's like you literally just booted up that world like 3 minutes ago. So again, I'm not saying absolutely this is the way it was, but I'm saying for me, it represents a way that of possibly reconciling these things. Maybe God did create our planet 6,000 years ago, but it looks like it's 4.5 billion years old. Like all the heavier elements in our bodies and in our planet were created, if we look out in the solar system, it looks like they were created in the core of like a dying star, right? As it's burning through its helium and its hydrogen. and it's creating these heavier elements and then it explodes. It looks like that's where we got heavier elements from. But maybe it only looks like that. Maybe it was actually just kind of booted up again, like the Minecraft world. Maybe it was just booted up 6,000 years ago and it just looks like that happened. And I feel like you can apply it to even to like specific instances of like if you have difficulty believing in Jesus's miracles, whether it's walking on the water or calming the seas or healing people, it's like if the water is a physical substance, then it is very difficult to like, okay, how could he have done that? Like I don't know how he could have done that. But if it's information, then he could be just controlling the information. He could have walked on the water because he's the god of this world and he controls that information. He could have fed the 5,000. So instead of it being like viewed as supernatural or magical, if our universe is made out of information, it allows us at least one mechanism for explaining how he did what he did, which again, for me, is just a pass to like, once I can somewhat reconcile that it's not perfect, but like I see a way that it might have happened, then I can come back to like more full belief.
I am so completely the opposite of you. Like
Okay.
this stuff is so hard for me to even like wrap my brain around. You're gonna have to dumb this down for me because I'm sure other people are going to have you dumb this down for them too. When you're talking about the information, like you're
Yeah.
gonna have to dumb that down for me a little
Sorry.
bit.
Okay.
No,
Yeah.
you're totally fine. Yeah, I need you to like dumb it down for me.
It's basically a video game that God created that we live in.
Okay. When you're using the word information, translate that for me.
So like any video game you interact with, or like whether you're, emails or video, like this video that we're talking
Okay.
about, all the audio and everything, all of it gets converted into information before it gets kind of reprocessed and we visualize it, right? So like all the audio gets converted into ones and zeros, all the video, etc. And the thing about information is that it's kind of arbitrary, right? Like you can kind of do anything with it that you want, right? So like you can have video games with any rules in them where you can jump off the walls or you can like have magical powers or whatever. So like when you look at a video game, you're not like, oh, that's impossible. Like you can't do that. Well, like we can because we can write the code, we can write the computer code kind of any way that we want. I don't know.
I think I'm getting it. And my daughter is an avid Minecraft player. So,
Okay.
even though I am like so far from anything, like my brain just doesn't I'm getting it though. I'm getting it. Like what you're saying is that I'm sure there's probably so many people listening to this that are just laughing at me because I like my brain just
Or,
works so differently than
or,
yours.
or laughing at me, being like, what's that guy rambling about? Yeah.
But it's interesting because this is such an important conversation and like it's so fascinating to me to see how your brain works in this way. So I am just loving this, by the way. But
Okay. So to explain a little bit more about the craziness, right,
yeah.
is like a big part of the problem, like with our creation, like of our bodies, is just like, well, we have like billions of DNA base pairs, and there's all this evidence of evolution going back, even billions of years. Right? I guess if it's information, then it may not have been that way, right? Like our bodies look like they evolved, but like literally God could have created them like yesterday, you know?
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
so I think that's the thing about information is that because we have arbitrary control over it, because you can kind of do anything with it, then what it allows is for us to look at the universe and see things that look a certain way and be like, oh, that's super fascinating that it looks that way. So for example, like if you go in the Siberian tundra and like the permafrost is melting or whatever, and you dig up a mammoth, you could pull out its DNA and like, oh wow, this mammoth lived here. But the thing is, if it's information, that mammoth may have never lived in this particular world, right? It just looks like it did because we see the remnant of it. So for example, like God could have created it and then made a copy of it. And so
Mhm.
like on our copy, we only have like recent history. It has all the information left over from like a previous copy, but that doesn't mean that the mammoths and us evolving from pond scum and all that actually happened in this particular copy. So anyway, I don't know if that helps kind of
Yeah.
explain how it.
No, it does. It's just it's mind-blowing to me and so fascinating how I don't know, like I just can't wait to share this video because it's so fascinating.
Someone got whacked with the crazy stick over here.
No,
Um,
no, not at all. No, seriously. And it's I don't know, it's really incredible. So, okay, so you come to this realization. You're like, "Hey, this is a way that this could possibly make these puzzle pieces fit in my brain."
Yes. Yeah, and it's like, I can now, like, fully believe, like, this is when God says he did these things, I can believe that he did them. I don't have to, make qualms about it or say, that the evidence is contrary to the stories that I'm reading in the gospel. So for me, it was like, that's super, yeah, super fulfilling and has allowed me to maintain my devotion, I guess, and conversion. But and there was kind of one last aspect that I still struggled with. So part of it is like, okay, how do you reconcile the gospel with like the physical world, right? And which we talked about. Another problem though I had was, and I wouldn't say it was like a cause of my faith crisis, but like it was definitely something that I didn't understand and I wanted to reconcile, which was that so many social theories do not support the gospel. So for example, like when you read in the Book of Mormon, it's like if you're righteous, you'll prosper in the land. There's this kind of coupling of righteousness to prosperity. And then so what I thought was like, growing up studying the gospel, what I thought is like the more I study economics, the more I study whatever cognitive science or ethics or whatever, the more it's going to point back to these gospel truths. But, I over and over again, like, I was finding that they weren't, right? Like, I don't know, maybe I need to look in more places. I looked in a lot of places, and I couldn't find, like, "Okay, here's pointing to righteousness. Like, here's the baseline of righteousness, and here's how economics builds out from there." And, like, another example is when Jesus, during his ministry, they're like, "What are the most important rules?" And it's just like, okay, he came down to earth, he's got his 3-year ministry, he's dying, of his 3 years, like his summary was, love God and love your neighbor as yourself, or in other words, the golden rule. And when you think about like, okay, so that's what he thought was the most important thing. And then let's look over at these other secular theories. Do they point back to the golden rule? And like over and over again, like I felt like they don't, right? I feel like the golden rule in secular theories is just kind of something that's like, oh, like, oh, you're a sweet little kid, it's nice to believe that when you're young, but you kind of grow out of it or whatever. So I've read a lot about history, like the founding fathers and enlightenment and whatever, to try to really get into their heads of how they thought. And I feel like they had a kind of expansive view of Christ, right? They thought that like his teachings of the golden rule applied not only to, like bringing brownies to your neighbor, but also in big things like how you structure the government. And but then I feel like what's happened over time is kind of a shrinkage where like if you have problems with your plumbing, you call a plumber, right? And that makes sense. You're not like, oh, let me go look in the Bible. If you have problems with your electricity, you call an electrician. But then over time, I think what's happened is like if you have an economics question or if you have an ethics question, you go to the economist, you go to the ethicists, you go to the social science, the cognitive scientists. And I feel like what's happened is that the influence that Jesus has and the gospel has is kind of shrinking as it's being crowded out by these secular theories. Which again, if they pointed back to gospel truths, that would be okay, but they don't seem to, at least in my opinion. And so that was one last thing that just drove me crazy. I had to like figure out like who was right. Either the economists are right or Jesus is right. And my money's on Jesus. So like how do I figure this out? Anyway, so I kind of like maybe more indirectly stumbled upon it. So I wrote a book, and this book is inspired by my own kind of experience. So the book is called Get It, A System for Situational Genius. And the reason that I, started on this like endeavor was because like growing up, I was like situationally challenged. I was not very street smart. So I'm, like embarrassing myself, having cringeworthy moments and like, hey, what happened there? Like, what's going on? And people just like, oh, like, he's that guy that doesn't get it, you know. Anyway, so it kind of set me on this journey of like, if like people can't tell me what's going on, if like you can't explain to me the rules of how these situations work, I'm going to try to find it somewhere else. As I looked to figure out like what these situational patterns are, put me on this kind of very interesting intellectual quest, I guess. And what I found was that there are books like Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, he won the Nobel Prize in economics, even though he's not an economist. But what he wrote about were like we have two systems. We have a conscious mind and a subconscious mind. And one of the things he writes about is how our subconscious mind is actually in charge of making sense of situations. So like when you walk into a situation, your subconscious mind is trying to figure out, okay, like who are my friends, who are my enemies, like what are their motives, like what are they going to do next? Just very naturally does these things. But the problem with that is that what I found is that like, okay, well, my subconscious doesn't have the whole set of rules like everyone else's subconscious. Like, where do I go? And the people that have the whole set of rules, well, they don't need the rules written down. In my opinion, they never got around to writing the rules down for the rest of us that needed them. And so I kind of use the analogy of like of language, right? So when you're a kid and you're learning language, you learn language subconsciously, automatically assimilate. And it's really amazing that your subconscious can do that, right? Because some languages, whatever it's Polish or Chinese or whatever, they could have very difficult grammars, very complex forms of like syntax or whatever. But kids just learn it, and if you go up to a kid and you're like, hey, like how often do you use the past subjunctive? They're going to look at you and be like, I have no idea what you're talking about, right? Because they do it just subconsciously even though may use the past subjunctive like every single day. But the thing with language, though, is that with language, we had a reason to come up with a grammar for language, right? Which is like once we started writing things down, yeah, which I think started with whatever disputes. It's like, hey, you promised me 7 cows. Like, no, I said 5 cows. Let's write that down. And then once they started writing things down, then they started to pay attention to like how language is structured and they created a grammar for language. What I found was that in my opinion, and I think I kind of go to show that we never created a grammar for situations, how they work, how our subconscious mind makes sense of them, like what patterns all situations have in common. The reason I get into all of that is because I think that there are truths that are these rules that our subconscious mind is applying that secular theories aren't taking into account because we just automatically do it and we never developed this grammar. So one of those is like the golden, again, coming back to the golden rule. It's like, well, the golden rule is like this amazing alignment strategy that we are applying all the time and we don't know that we're doing it, which to me is just like, what? Let's say that you're super into holidays and your husband is not, right? So holidays are in like your value circle and holidays are in his like don't care circle. That's a misalignment because like over time you're like, oh, I wish you were more into holidays. I wish you'd help out decorating or whatever. But that's where things like the golden rule come into place, where he's like, I love my wife. Holidays are important to her. So I'm going to move holidays from my don't care circle into my value circle and start helping you with the things that you care about. And it could be like a husband loves sports and then a wife is like hates sports, right? Like got this long honeydew list and I don't like you wasting all this time on it. But the golden rule again comes in to help with these types of misalignments where, you start to say, well, I love my husband and he gets, he enjoys it. So I'm going to move sports from like my disvalue circle that, things I dislike to my don't care circle. So, I'm not going to value sports. I'm not going to get all the way there, but my golden rule, like doing unto him what I would have done to me is not getting on his case maybe. So I don't know. But the thing is that like the golden rule isn't, I think a lot of times we just think about it in interpersonal terms, but it is what I've discovered is it's an amazing alignment strategy in so many other different circumstances. Like, so for example, if you start a job, you don't know like what the company really cares about, right? What does the company value? What does it disvalue? Like what outcomes is the company trying to avoid? What does the company not care about? Because a new hire, when you're trying to align yourself with a new company and add value, you're trying to maximize what the company values. You're trying to minimize what it disvalues, and then you try not to focus on the things it doesn't care about because that's, of course, a waste of time. So I think the way that our subconscious does that is that we start to do unto the company what we think the company wants done unto it, right? And it's amazing like how this works. For example, like if you're a firefighter, while you're on the clock, this kind of golden rule of alignment is in place, right? So like if there's a fire out there, you're like, hey, we're going to go fight that fire. I'm going to put my own life at risk. We're going to save people, etc. Because that's what I'm paid to do, right? I'm applying the golden rule to my employer. But the moment that you're not on the clock anymore, like it turns off, right? You're just like, oh no, that's actually someone else's thing. I feel like the golden rule shouldn't just it could be applied to even more and more entities. And I think this is how the founding fathers actually thought. So for example, should religions treat other religions the way that they would want to be treated? I'm not aware of any, kind of secular theory that really asks that question, but I think the answer is yes. Like they should treat each other the way that they would want to be treated. Should companies treat their competitors the way that they would want to be treated? you might start to think like, what does that even mean? Like, how would that make sense? Like, how can a religion treat other religions? And to illustrate that point, what I mean is that, like, so for example, when Thomas Jefferson lived in the Commonwealth of Virginia, grew up in Virginia, there was an established church, right? It was the Anglican Church, and you were forced to pay tithes to the Anglican Church. And also, they had outlawed the preaching of any other faith in Virginia. Some of the founding fathers, when they visited other colonies, they're just like, oh, I love breathing the free air of these other colonies, because Virginia they felt like was particularly oppressed, right? They would lock up Baptist preachers and things like that. If you apply the golden rule to this situation and you say, well, was the Anglican Church treating other faiths the way that it would want to be treated? Obviously, the answer is no. They were disallowing other people from preaching. They were taxing people and collecting the tithes just for their faith. So I think the founding fathers looked at this problem and they said, how do we create a situation where religions treat each other according to the golden rule? And so they came up with the First Amendment, which is disallowing the government from giving benefits to particular religions, benefits or punishments, right? And so effectively what happens is, if you're a religion and you want to go lobby the government for something, so say you're the Anglican religion, you're like, hey, I want you to tax people and pay me the tithes. Today, the federal government's like, hey, I can't do that. I don't have the ability to do that to favor one particular religion. Or if you go to the government and you say, hey, these Mormon elders are causing a lot of problems. I want you to outlaw their ability to preach. The federal government's like, we can't do that. We don't have the right to target or punish a specific religion. And so the effect then is to bring religions kind of into a kind of golden rule alignment. It's not to say that religions can't approach the government or governments can't come up with laws that affect religions. They can, right? I mean, you still can't defraud, you still can't, abuse kids. But anytime a religion is going to the government to ask for something, they know that the same rules, the same preferences, or the same punishments are going to be applied to other faiths. And so what that means is that they're like, hey, I'm only going to seek changes in law that are going to apply to me and all other religions equally. So it's kind of this interesting instance of using the golden rule to kind of keep religions aligned.
So you essentially, like, just to recap a little bit,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
essentially had like this issue in your mind with like the golden rule is not something that really is something that people are following, different organizations are following, but then you started to find all of these different instances where it actually does apply in all of these different spaces, and then you were able to kind of reconcile those pieces together.
yeah, exactly. To kind of, in my opinion, like re-enthrone, and again, this is just like one way, but to say like, if Jesus said that, he said it for good reason. Are we taking him as seriously as we should be? Right? If he said that, are we applying it to all of the circumstances that it might be applied to? Which today we're kind of not, I think, because of this crowding. Like today, I don't think there are any economists that are like, how do we build a golden rule society, or ethicists or whatever. But I think that's what they should be doing, because it's this amazing alignment strategy. And it's what Jesus said was most important. Yeah. So
Mhm.
anyway,
That's so awesome. Now, tell me in particular, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints,
yeah.
you're reconciling Jesus Christ, you're reconciling God, particularly the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Tell me how you maintain your testimony of the church. You've got these different puzzle pieces that are falling into place for you. So tell me how you maintain and nourish your testimony of the church.
For me, I just am like awestruck by the truth of it all, right? Of specifically the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, where it's like serving a mission, being exposed to other faiths. It's like you just start to realize that, like, we have to me, it all testifies of not only the Christianity, but of the church's specific, the restored gospel specific version of the truth. It doesn't matter whether it's like an emphasis on families. I feel like the church to me is like, has preserved all of those truths. Over dinner, we're having discussions. Hey, what did Jesus mean about this? Or like, why does the Book of Mormon talk about that? Like, why is this truth important? Of course, I go to church. I feel the Spirit when I go to church. I feel the Spirit talking with my son who's on his mission. So anyway, for me, I know you're not supposed to be like obsessed with the gospel, but for me, it's just like this natural. It's just what I love and what I want to do. And having kind of removed these barriers, I just feel like it gives full expression to like I believe in like our God and His work, and I feel like our God is like, hey, I want to further my work and have more children, right? And you can become a God like me. And that's something that I'm like, hey, I don't know if I'm like qualified, but I'm gonna try. I'm gonna try to help him out in this work. In the gospel, if that doesn't jive with you, or maybe that's not your thing. Because I've talked to people about the gospel, like, hey, maybe what if I don't want to do that? And it's like, well, in the gospel, it's like that's okay. There are these kingdoms for you where you can be happy and you can prosper and all those other things, but maybe not still, join God in what he's doing. So anyway, like I'm kind of like super bought into the whole package of
Yeah.
uh, there's no way, in my opinion, that Joseph Smith could have like fabricated this, future proofed it. As I look at the expanse, it's just like too elegant. There's just too much truth to it. Yeah.
That is so cool. I love it. I'm mind blown. Like, I'm so happy that you reached out and that we were able to get you on the podcast. It's just so fascinating to see how different people go. Like, I interviewed somebody last night on my podcast, and it's like the stories of how people, it's
Well,
so crazy.
and I
Yes.
really appreciate what you're doing and allowing us. Like, I had a buddy who's like, "Hey, you have interesting ideas. Maybe you should like share those." And I was like, "Okay, I should probably get out there." So I'm really, really appreciate forums like you're providing to people to
Yes.
create this marketplace of, how do we find our way back? So
Mhm.
thank you so much.
Thank you. And if anybody has questions for you, are you open to like
Yeah,
conversations with people? Okay.
yeah, absolutely. I'm pretty easy to find on Twitter. Just I
Okay.
think it's Brett_Alder.
Okay.
Yep,
Awesome. Well,
awesome.
yes, I'm sure there will be people that are going to really want to chat with you about some of the things that you've experienced. So
That'd be great. I'd welcome that. Awesome. Thank you, Ashley.
thank you so much, Brett.
Have a good one. See you.
A lot of people have asked us how they can support the podcast, and we have created a Comeback Podcast merch line on our website, www.comebackpodcast.org. All of the money made from the merch goes right back into the podcast. So if you are interested in supporting the podcast and you want to purchase some merch, we would love it. Check it out. Thank you so much for being a supporter of the Comeback Podcast and listening to our episodes. It would mean so much to us if you would like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. It helps other people be able to find us, and we want to share this message to everyone.